In the aftermath of the First World War, Carl Jung confessed his thoughts. This war has pitilessly revealed to civilized man that he is still a barbarian. But the psychology of the individual corresponds to the psychology of the nation. What the nation does is done also by each individual, and so long as the individual does it, the nation also does it. Only the change in the attitude of the individual is the beginning of the change in the psychology of the nation. This concern would remain a central theme in Jung's works, as he believed that it was up to the individual to resist the overwhelming influence of the masses during times of great social and political upheaval. Jung was keen to note the danger that collective movements posed to society, and witnessed firsthand the destruction and anarchy which the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century were responsible for. Jung felt a great sense of responsibility as an intellectual to give his insights into the psychology of mass movements, why people could become so fanatically devoted to certain political ideologies, and how development at the individual level could help to resist the danger that these movements could pose. He made his thoughts known in an essay titled The Undiscovered Self, and in this video, we will study the central ideas presented by Jung in this work. Humans by nature gravitate towards others, and feel a strong urge to be accepted by a group. This in itself is not dangerous, but group psychology can potentially lead to a state which Jung called Mass-Mindedness, where the individual, instead of thinking for himself, allows the group to think for him. Even rationality may not be able to overcome the influence of mass-mindedness, as groups are often more suggestible than individuals. This has occurred in various political movements throughout history, and if it occurs at the level of the state, it can make the state susceptible to tyranny. The mass crushes out the insight and reflection that are still possible with the individual, and this necessarily leads to doctrinaire and authoritarian tyranny, if ever the constitutional state should succumb to a fit of weakness. Part of the reason for why collective movements have such a strong psychic force behind them is that groups tend to be self-affirming, even if the ideas of a group are irrational or unethical. Speaking out against the ideas of a popular political or social movement can lead to ostracism or alienation, which can make people reluctant to resist the will of the mass movement. As Jung writes, if it is a very large group, the collective psyche will be more like the psyche of an animal, which is the reason why the ethical attitude of large organizations is always doubtful. The psychology of a large crowd inevitably sinks to the level of mob psychology. That is why this group experience is very much more frequent than an individual experience of transformation. It is also much easier to achieve, because the presence of so many people together exerts great suggestive force. The individual in a crowd easily becomes the victim of his own suggestibility. It is only necessary for something to happen, for instance, a proposal to be backed by the whole crowd, and we too are all for it, even if the proposal is immoral. In the crowd, one feels no responsibility, but also no fear. As a result, it becomes very difficult to counter the dangerous ideas put forth by such movements, which is why they can have such an immense psychological influence over their adherents. However, Jung also believed that the collective ideologies of the 20th century were fundamentally a symptom of a much more widespread development, the declining influence of religion over people's lives. With the birth of scientific rationalism and materialism, religion has largely been pushed back as a major part of the lives of many people. However, what people fail to realize is that religion developed as a means to fulfill certain psychological needs that people have, namely the feeling of participation in a transcendent purpose. Religion once imbued our lives with a sense of universal meaning, but as scientific progress replaces religious doctrines, religion can no longer serve this purpose, despite the fact that people still instinctively desire a sense of purpose. The modern scientific world has detached us from our religious roots, but has accidentally created a gap in our spiritual lives, and we may gravitate towards mass movements in order to fulfill the need to feel that our lives have meaning. Within mass movements, people can feel as if they are part of something larger than themselves, and be provided with a sense of belonging. As such, these movements can fulfill the spiritual needs of a person, which religion can no longer provide. Political ideologies begin to replace religious ideologies. Scientific rationalism has also had the unintended effect of treating people like a set of statistics rather than as individuals, which can lead to people being treated as if they are just cogs in a wheel. This development becomes logically unavoidable the moment the individual combines with the mass, and thus renders himself obsolete. Apart from the agglomeration of huge masses, in which the individual disappears anyway, one of the chief factors responsible for psychological mass-mindedness is scientific rationalism, which robs the individual of his foundations and dignity. As a social unit, he has lost his individuality and become a mere abstract number in the Bureau of Statistics. When people can no longer put faith in their religion, they may instead place their faith in the state, without recognizing that both God and the state are, technically speaking, abstract principles. The energy which at one time was devoted to the worship of God may instead be given to a tyrannical leader who claims to have the solution for all of life's difficulties. The state takes the place of God. That is why, seen from this angle, the socialist dictatorships are religions, and state slavery is a form of worship. The result, as always in such cases, is overcompensation in the form of fanaticism, which in its turn is used as a weapon for stamping out the least flicker of opposition. Free opinion is stifled, and moral decision ruthlessly suppressed, on the plea that the end justifies the means, even the vilest. The policy of the state is exalted to a creed. The leader or party boss becomes a demigod beyond good and evil, and his votaries are honored as heroes, martyrs, apostles, missionaries. This effect becomes exacerbated during times of social or economic turmoil, as such leaders may provide simple solutions to these problems, such as by blaming a particular group for societal distress, such as when Hitler blamed Jewish people, or when Stalin blamed the kulaks. People are more likely to be enchanted by simple messages with catchy slogans than they are to be persuaded by rationality or reason, especially if a political leader can use scapegoats to justify their actions. Jung himself was largely concerned with the psychological effects of religion, and recognized that religion developed as a psychological tool to help people through the difficulties of life. With this tool no longer in place, people naturally turn to other sources of spiritual participation. However, religion can also have a similar effect as state authority, and be used to justify political ideologies, for which reason Jung distinguished between religions and creeds. A creed gives expression to a definite collective belief, whereas the word religion expresses a subjective relationship to certain metaphysical, extra-mundane factors. Creeds can be just as dangerous and conducive to mass-mindedness as radical political movements, but they tend to be counterbalanced by the individual relationship that a person has to their religion, especially since the supreme authority is God rather than a living dictator. So how can we counter the phenomenon of mass-mindedness, whether the result of a political ideology or a creed? The key, according to Jung, is the individual's understanding of himself, and the treatment of himself as an autonomous unique being, rather than as a unit whose existence is defined by his participation in a group. Becoming aware of our own innate psychology can serve as a bulwark against the overwhelming influence of the masses, who tend to be swayed unconsciously. We need to allow ourselves moments of solitude, away from the influence of other minds, in order to explore and understand who we really are. Jung observed that the vast majority of people lived in a relatively unconscious manner, with little or no knowledge of the unconscious, but this knowledge is vital for maintaining some semblance of autonomy. Resistance to the organized mass can be effected only by the man who is as well organized in his individuality as the mass itself. Self-knowledge entails more than just knowledge of our conscious egos, but also includes knowledge of the unconscious. We must become aware of our unconscious minds, because many of our dark tendencies or bad habits stem unknowingly from the unconscious, and bringing unconscious contents to light can allow us to rectify these problems. For instance, once we know that humans naturally crave a sense of belonging, we can see how mass movements deceive us with a false sense of identity and meaning, and we may be better equipped to resist their influence. People are also largely unconscious of their own shadow sides, and their own capacity for evil. We readily acknowledge the evil which exists in other people, but we rarely ponder the possibility that we ourselves also hold the potential to commit great acts of evil, even if we do so unconsciously. Carl Jung frequently stressed the importance of recognizing this fundamental fact, as he claimed that our lack of knowledge of the shadow makes us more susceptible to its evil. It is, however, true that much of the evil in the world is due to the fact that man in general is hopelessly unconscious, and it is also true that with increasing insight, we can combat this evil at its source in ourselves. Most people, however, do not accept their shadows, and instead project their own evil onto other people. This shadow projection is one of the chief causes of hatred and animosity in the world, especially if it occurs at a political level. It is the nature of political bodies always to see the evil in the opposite group, just as the individual has an ineradicable tendency to get rid of everything he does not know and does not want to know about himself by foisting it off on somebody else. Although it can be difficult to accept the shadow as a part of oneself, this is much more preferable to projecting your shadow onto somebody else. One important human instinct, which frequently grips our minds from the unconscious, is the power principle, as people naturally seek their own empowerment. Whenever people feel that they lack power as an individual, they may be attracted to voices who can give them a sense of empowerment, which they could not receive on their own accord. Knowledge of this fact can reduce the likelihood of a person being trapped by this poisonous cycle. Self-knowledge, that is, knowledge of the unconscious, also strengthens our conscious will by allowing us to recognize the factors which may thwart our consciousness unknowingly from the unconscious. A stronger conscious ego reduces the grip which a tyrant may have over our own wills. Just as the chaotic movements of the crowd are impelled in a definite direction by a dictatorial will, so the individual in his dissociated state needs a directing and ordering principle. Ego consciousness would like to let its own will play this role, but overlooks the existence of powerful unconscious factors which thwart its intentions. If it wants to reach the goal of synthesis, it must first get to know the nature of these factors. This includes becoming conscious of the instinctual forms of the human psyche, which Jung termed archetypes. Since archetypes influence our behavior from the unconscious, awareness of these archetypal forms of the human mind can allow us to direct our behavior in a way so as not to be under the control of our instincts. But we should also realize that these archetypal forms will always exist with us, and so rather than repressing them, we should become aware of their power over us. Forming a positive relationship with one's archetypal nature can be empowering and spiritually fulfilling. As Jung writes, "They are potentialities of the greatest dynamism, and it depends entirely on the preparedness and attitude of the conscious mind, whether the eruption of these forces, and the images and ideas associated with them, will tend towards construction or catastrophe. The massification of society can be resisted by one who understands his or her own spiritual needs, and is thereby able to avoid being impelled by way of the unconscious influences which tend to grip mass movements. Everybody knows how hard it is to speak out against popular opinions, but the man or woman who feels themselves as an individual, rather than as a mere unit amidst the group, may summon the courage to withstand the pull of collective factors, as only the strong individual can resist the evil which can potentially manifest from the unconscious crowd mind."